what's up, guys? This is going to be a breakdown video of an edit from the Joint House Committee on the 9/11 attacks. Senator John Kyle, a joint member panelist, is going to be interviewing a number of intelligence officials. Michael Rolnice, who is sitting to the left and not behind a partition, and two men hiding behind a partition, hiding their identities. And they are Tom Wilshire, the Deputy Chief of Alex Station, and Steve Bongardt from the counterterrorism, the Washington, D.C. counterterrorism unit. So here we go.
Both for their work on the behalf of the American people and as representatives of the three entities now for which they work. And I'd like for them to know how much we appreciate their work. I'd like to have them pass it on to the agents and officers into the field. It is very easy for people to be brilliant Monday morning quarterbacks after the fact when we've gone back and tried to piece everything together. But when you're in the middle of a battle, it's not always easy. Everyone agrees that mistakes were made, that things weren't done that could have been done. And in fact, some of you have indicated that was a great frustration to you. I suggest that, especially during the last decade, one of the reasons, and it's our job really to ask the reasons why, there are at least 3 or 4 reasons that our committee has begun to come up with. Obviously, everybody can make mistakes. I make about 400 a day myself. And we're never going to change human nature. We will always make mistakes. But are there systemic things that resulted in more mistakes than should have ordinarily been made? And a couple of things that we've heard from these witnesses here today point us in the right direction. 1, a lack of resources. I'll get into that in a moment. And 2, risk aversion due to the creation of walls and misunderstandings about authorities. And Mr. Chairman, to a large extent, policymakers, including members of the United States Congress and the executive branch, are responsible for both of those. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit too. So I just want to put that in perspective. But there are 2 preliminary things I'd like to comment on. First, I want to note that I share Senator Shelby's concerns about sensitive information being revealed in these open hearings. 2 of the witnesses have made the same point, one saying that our testimony will be studied by our enemies, and that's absolutely true. We are revealing in open session today a lot of information about how we operate, which will be very useful to our enemies. That's not good, and it's not necessary. Specifically, with respect to the witnesses before us today, they've all been interviewed by our staff, and we've had conversations with some of them as members. The story has been written. It was presented very nicely by the head of our staff here today. So this hearing is for show. This isn't to obtain information. Now, there's a point at which it's important for us to present the information that we've derived to the American people. But it should be when we're all done. And it shouldn't be in a setting in which the witnesses are having to be very careful about what they say because they may say something that's classified. The second thing I'd like to say is that there's been an implication that this committee would be a lot more effective if only the FBI and the Department of Justice and the CIA and others would just cooperate with us. And Mr. Chairman, to some extent, there may be some validity in some of that. But the other side of the story is that as far as I know, they've been very cooperative. And to some extent, I think we're overreaching. Let me give you an example. Reading through the clips of the Arizona Republic, my home paper today, FBI agent is asked to testify publicly on Phoenix memo. And I quote the story in part. A joint House-Senate intelligence panel, that's us, is calling Phoenix-based FBI agent Kenneth Williams to testify next Thursday for the first time publicly about his July 2001 memorandum warning that potential terrorists were attending U.S. flight schools. Senate Intelligence Committee Chairman Bob Graham also says the Joint Committee is intending to release its findings on exactly what happened to that memo after it was sent to headquarters in Washington. Quote, the report is done, end quote, said Graham in an interview on Thursday. Going on down the story, Williams has already testified behind closed doors to the Senate Judiciary Committee. We already have all of the information that we can possibly get from Agent Williams. It is absolutely unnecessary to have him testify publicly. And yet this committee is making a show out of it, and the Department of Justice naturally is pushing back against that. Here is a letter dated September 17th from a representative of the Department of Justice to Chairman Graham and Goss, and I just read in part from the letter. Yesterday, the FBI learned that the Middle East television network Al Jazeera recently broadcast the name and face of at least one FBI employee, Kenneth Williams, whom the committee seeks to present as a witness in an open hearing next week. As you know, Agent Williams has been interviewed by GIC staff and has provided a closed briefing to members, 2 of them, as a matter of fact.
Let me give you up to speed. Ken Williams, who I've interviewed for the Darkened Hour, actually is a Phoenix FBI agent who had an informant by the name of Henry Ellen, who was a Muslim convert, who was giving him information about radical fundamentalists who were in the Arizona cities of Scottsdale, learning to fly at flight schools. In fact, Arizona is home to the most flight schools in the country. And this information was sent back to Ken Williams, and one particular person who is based on the Phoenix memo is Zachariah Subra, who actually was interviewed by Ken Williams and another agent. And in his house were pictures of Osama bin Laden. And basically, he said that he hopes that the United States comes under attack and that he would participate. And then after the interview, Ken Williams basically said, wow, we got to watch this guy. He's dangerous. And basically was pulled off because he was, the agency basically said that there was really not much in the way of a threat, Arab fundamentalism, but there was an arsonist happening, was lighting fires, and they asked Ken Williams to investigate the case, which took about almost 2 years off. By the time he got back in 2001, his release of the Phoenix memo only reached a couple of people, in which he sent the memo out. George Bush didn't read it until a year later. After the 9/11 attacks, a memo went to people in the Radical Fundamentalist Unit in Minnesota, John O'Neill in New York of the Counterterrorism Bin Laden Unit, and certain other people, but nobody acted on it.
Agent Williams recently asked that his concerns be brought to the attention of the committee. His comments include concerns about the handling of his closed-door appearance before the committee's joint inquiry. And here's what he said. Reporters showed up at the front door of my residence, and my picture and personal information appeared in the national news. I can only imagine that a public session will result in even greater exposure. If the reporters could locate my residence, so could Al-Qaeda or any other terrorist organization.
Right, the danger is that he was an active agent. That's the danger.
Then the letter proceeds. He also expressed concern for the safety of himself and his family, saying, I sincerely believe that my appearance in a public session would be detrimental to my personal safety and the safety of my family. Nonetheless, Agent Williams concludes by noting his willingness to appear again before the committee's joint inquiry in closed session to cover any issues left unresolved or that are newly developed since his last appearance. And he notes that and says he'd love to return and answer any questions we might have in closed hearing. Part of this, in other words, is theater. And, Mr. Chairman, I just can't express strongly enough that we're asking these people to put their lives on the line, and I think we'd ought to be a little bit careful about throwing around accusations that people are not cooperating with us, when part of the reason is for their own safety.
Right.
Moreover, any disputes we're having about what's in the material that he produced, the so-called Phoenix memo, we know everything we have to know about that memo, and I say we, the public. The stuff that hasn't been declassified yet, nobody needs to know. It's names, dates, places that have no bearing on the ultimate issue, but are very important in the intelligence context. So I want to make that point to make it clear that there is a difference of opinion here about just what this committee ought to be doing publicly. Now let me get to the questions. As I said, it seems to me that there are 2 themes that derive from both our report and the witnesses who have been here. Namely, that we didn't have the resources to do what needed to be done, and secondly, there was a lot of confusion about what our legal authority was. And I just now want to quote briefly from the testimony here. First, with respect to the resource issue. This is the testimony of our CIA witness. What I will say here is that new procedures and training aside, they are also the kinds of misses, the mistakes in other words, that happen when people who are very competent, dedicated people such as CIA officers and FBI agents and analysts involved in aspects of the story are simply overwhelmed. The counterterrorism business often does not feature a large team going after a single target, but rather one or two officers juggling multiple activities against many people simultaneously trying to make sense of what it means. Which target deserves priority attention and balancing the interests of multiple stations, liaison services, and other agencies. Mr. Kojum said, just to quote one statement, the tip-off is now the primary focal point for entering intelligence community information on known or suspected terrorists into class. However, tip-off is not adequately staffed to deal with the increased workload. Talks about the small dedicated staff frequently coming in after hours and on nights and weekends and so on. In the testimony that was presented by our staff, and I'll just mention a couple of these, there are numerous references to the lack of resources. For example,
yeah, this is like the complaint of the intelligence community. There was a lack of resources, a lack of manpower. Well, after the 9/11 attacks, the Bush administration basically acquiesced to the whims of the CIA and the NSA and the FBI. In fact, when they went before the appropriations committees later on during the year, they basically got a blank check for each one. In fact, the NSA got the biggest check of all, and that's because they conduct signals intelligence, and they're the most powerful agency of the three. And so General Hayden of the NSA, and then you had the DCI, the CIA, George Tenet, and Robert Mueller, director of the FBI, who were basically complaining all throughout these two congressional inquiries that, hey, listen, we weren't getting enough information because we lacked the manpower. The information that we had, we couldn't transcribe it in time to try and stop these attacks because we didn't have enough manpower. The funding wasn't there. There was a lot of cutbacks during the late 1990s. George Tenet basically, fired or forced out a lot of the case officers, and it's been around for decades, and hired a lot of these bureaucrats to work in management in Virginia. And the FBI basically notoriously working with these, old computer machines, and were considered the most dinosaur of the three in regards to up-to-date technology. The NSA was the premier agency regarding up-to-date technology, and indeed, they're the most prominent agency in regards to collecting data, because their data is instantaneously. And with the advent of the internet, basically, they became the premier agency in regards to collecting all data, even though the CIA has in more stations around the world. The NSA listens to everybody's phone calls. And what do you think they're listening to? This is the argument I make about 9/11, pre 9/11. The NSA ran two operations, one on bin Laden's satellite phone, and one was a house in Yemen. What do you think they were talking about on those lines? So if they were talking about operations, well, that's how you can manipulate an operation before it even happens. Isn't that exactly what happened on September 11, 2001?
On one of the statements that there were not enough people to handle CTC's workload at the time. As a result, informational cables such as the March 2000 message, which was much the subject of our discussion here, received less attention than action items.
Right. And you know why? That's bullshit too, because that cable was actually read by over 50 agents. The cable that said that Nawaf al-Hazmi, Khalid al-Mihdhar had U.S. visas and they were inside the United States. That information was intentionally withheld from the FBI. The question is why? We'll go back and watch my previous breakdown videos. In fact, I'll do you one better. I did a podcast specifically about that cable and the CIA, Tom Wilshire, Cofer Black, and George Tenet in the Joint House inquiry, and all three gave different answers. And I think that's one of my most important podcasts.
Other employees told us that they typically did not even have time to read information cables. Another, we were told that the matter was dropped because the agent had to move on to other things. New York FBI agents told us they tried to convince FBI headquarters to open a criminal investigation on Al-Midhar, given the importance of the search and the limited resources that were available to all intelligence investigations. We're going to get into that more in a little bit. I could go on and on. Let me just ask the first question here because of a comment that the CIA agent here made during his testimony. We know that while we had some contact with these people while they were in Malaysia, that thereafter there was less contact. I believe you testified, sir, that we were unable to mobilize what we needed to mobilize to remain in, that was your direct quotation, and I'll paraphrase, to remain in the kind of contact that would have been useful with those people. Is that an accurate statement of what you said?
Yes.
Is that an example of having resources stretched too thin to do the job that you'd have liked to have been able to do?
Unfortunately, not that particular instance. That was a separate reason for that. A larger part of the community wasn't able to. They were busy doing other things related to terrorism. But that's the. I think.
Well, excuse me.
Right.
When you're too busy to attend to this because you're busy focused on other things, that might suggest that you're prioritizing.
It wasn't what I'm. I guess what I'm saying is it wasn't necessarily the CIA's choice. It was not a
Okay.
U.S. choice.
Okay, and I know where you're going with that. But go ahead with the rest of what you wanted to say.
Oh, that was it.
Okay. Well, let me just ask you a general question then, whether you found occasions in which the lack of resources inhibited you from doing your job. Start with the CIA agent.
Yes. I think that, thank you. I'm not going to make a speech, I promise.
No.
The lack of resources is critical, and if I could shift the context just a tiny bit, I made mention in my testimony of 10 months of pounding in Afghanistan, and yet we still regard al-Qaeda as a threat. Before 11 September, what the United States government basically had were the resource overseas, offensively, were the resources of the CIA alongside the FBI in many cases. Is an intelligence problem. It's fairly clear that the director's discussion about declaring war on al-Qaeda is not something that he's empowered to do officially by the Constitution. That choice remains elsewhere. Al-Qaeda, in fact, had declared war on the United States and nearly sank $1 billion warship in the process of doing that. What you had facing a vastly more fit al-Qaeda, in other words, were a few civilians who were as I've heard recently described, a platoon in a brigade-sized field, and doing the best they can. So yes, there was a lack of resources.
Oh, wait a minute. Now, that's Tom Wilshire, by the way, the deputy chief of Alex Station, or the Bin Laden issue station. Lack of resources. Well, for one, the FBI took over the matter regarding USS Cole. That was a federal matter. And they basically weren't very accommodating because the Yemen ambassador to the United States, Barbara Bodine, found John O'Neill to be quite distasteful, so to speak, to leave it less insulting. So John O'Neill basically got pushed out of the operation, but they allowed his assistant, Ali Soufran, to try to obtain more information regarding that investigation. John O'Neill went back. Now, the CIA basically were monitoring one of the facilitators of the USS Cole at this point, and his name was Wali bin Attash, also known as Khalad. They only knew him as Khalad because when they were listening to the phone calls in this house in Yemen, which was owned by Ahmed al-Hada, the person on the other end of the line is speaking in Arabic. His name was Khalad, and he was speaking to either Ahmed al-Hada, who's the owner of the house, or Khalid al-Midar, who actually is married to the daughter of Ahmed al-Hada, Hoda al-Hada, which made him the son-in-law. And he would reside in this house from time to time. And so did Nawaf al-Hazmi, who was a very close friend to Khalid al-Midar. So when that call came in December of '99 regarding Wali bin Attash talking to Khalid al-Mihdhar about this meeting in Malaysia. The NSA, for the first time, got the names of Khalid and Khalid al-Mihdhar and Khalid. And that later turned out to be Wali bin Attash. So the NSA did have the necessary manpower. The FBI certainly did have the certain manpower regarding USS Cole. So why is the CIA complaining about manpower? Because it's not about manpower. It's about acting on the information that they didn't want to share. So they had to make an excuse up. Well, we just say it's lack of manpower. We couldn't act on the information that we have. No, that's a lie. You had the information. You just didn't act on it because you didn't want to share it for whatever reason.
Just to any of the other witnesses, I quoted Mr. Kojum, who talked about his people being stretched pretty thin. Do any of you want to comment on this issue of resources?
Senator, I couldn't possibly let that pass. I think, as my agency colleague.
That's Michael Rolnice. He's over here. This is Tom Wilshire. This is Steve Bongardt. He's FBI out of Washington, D.C. He's hiding behind a partition because these two guys are active.
Would attest, I spend a fair amount of time at CTC, and he spends a fair amount of time in our headquarters for a lot of different reasons, part of which are competing priorities, but a big part of which is in the year 2000, the year 2001, the FBI was not allowed to hire to attrition. We have more agents and man hours walking out the door than we have coming in, and you don't have to do the math to figure out that at some point in time that's going to have a deleterious effect on all your criminal investigations as well as your counterintelligence and counterterrorism investigations. The support people in particular who've worked these attacks, and I think it's important to put into context not just the past 3.5 years, but we've talked about the Africa Embassy bombings. If you start there, the same people responsible for investigating the Africa Embassy bombings and then on to the deployment of Kosovo and the downing of Egypt Air, neither of which were terrorism, but it got handed to us. You work on up through the fall and the build up to the millennium. You have people who literally are, as someone told me, just learn to work tired, and I saw it every single day. And I cannot pass up the opportunity to commend them and to state for the record, for us, the American people, how much credit they deserve for this fight. They go months at a time without time off, long nights, long weekends, holidays, etc., without a single complaint by any of them. You roll then on into the Millennium event, and it's another month without time off. And this is pertinent to the discussion today because there is a tremendous effort underway to try to figure out whether or not Ahmed Rassam is tied to some other network, or is this the kind of problem we're going to have to deal with in the future. And there's a hand-in-hand effort between the Bureau and the agency and others around the world to try to figure that out. We now know that that was going to coincide with serious attacks in Jordan and the attack on the USS the Sullivans within a very short time frame.
Yeah, this was the original, the Millennium bombing plot, which was a transnational terrorist operation that involved a number of different terrorist groups, not necessarily just Al Qaeda. For example, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, if that name sounds familiar, he was head of a group called the Wal Jihad, I think it was Wal Jihad organization. So Wal Jihad group that later became Al Qaeda in Iraq, which later became Islamic State in the Levant currently. And this group basically was helped, facilitated by a notorious cleric in Jordan named Muhammad al-Makdisi, who was at that time in the early 2000s considered the most dangerous Muslim in the Arabian Peninsula, outside of bin Laden, who's actually in Afghanistan, not in the Arabian Peninsula. So, you know, this guy basically took this pimp and drug dealer and, you know, murderer, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, and turned him on to, you know, the Wahhabi faith, which basically he was in prison and he built this group up that basically became this group. He went to Afghanistan and got funding from bin Laden. Bin Laden really had no use for him there and told him to build training camps in Iraq, which was undergoing a civil war at the same time, and to take advantage. Well, while that was going on, L. Paul Bremer, who is acting on Bush's envoy regarding the elimination of the Ba'athist regime, created Iraqi Provisional Order number 1 and 2, which liquidated the military and law enforcement in Iraq. So you have a whole bunch of these military and law enforcement Ba'athist officials now without money. So in comes Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, that the United States created this vacuum, and he created this group called the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which basically was compromised of former Ba'athist officials who were training in, high-tech weaponry, creating bombs, how to kidnap people, and stuff like that. So the original members of the Islamic State in Levant were actually Ba'athist officials who were liquidated from their positions, thanks in part to the United States government.
Which would have stretched our resources incredibly. But they're patient. This is what they do for a living. So 10 months later, 17 sailors.
And by the way, just to add on that, the operation involved the bombing of a warship called the USS Sullivan's. But the boat that was carrying all these bombs on it sank because there was too many bombs in the boat. And later on, this became the bombing of the USS Cole. A lot of people that were involved with this operation, like Abu Zubaydah, used a code term that was heard by Jordanian authorities over the phone to another Al-Qaeda affiliate, and the code word was the big wedding, which is used for bombing or a big bombing and whatnot. And Ahmed Wassam, an Algerian, basically traveled through to Canada on a false passport called Benny Norris, and he commiserated with links up there. And there's this huge nexus in Canada, which is basically ignored by the media. And the only person that investigated this much is Nelson Martin's DJ thermal detonator. And I can understand why the media and most researchers don't research this, is because it is quite an extensive cell in Canada. And you'll notice that a lot of these border crossings from Europe and the Arabian Peninsula, they go northwards, go through the Eastern European countries, and then go into Canada and then into the United States.
When they find the opportunity to attack the USS Cole. So you have all of those investigations, and then leading on up into 9/11, being worked by an increasingly depleted supply of analysts, officers, agents, and managers. There are fewer FBI agents assigned on 9/11 worldwide to the terrorism problem than there were the week of the African embassy bombings. The director has noted that, he's corrected that, and we're going in the right direction. But I just think it's important to put that in context. And if I could say one more.
Yeah, and the reason why is because during the late 1990s, a lot of the funding, which varies from state to state. So let's just say New York. New York basically didn't take Arab fundamentalism seriously, even though they had the most experienced unit in the country, which is the Bin Laden unit created by John O'Neill in 1999. John O'Neill certainly took Arab fundamentalism quite seriously, but a lot of people didn't like John O'Neill. So a lot of the funding went to La Cosa Nostra unit in New York, or the Joint Terrorism Task Force, or the drug, which was the crack epidemic that was happening in the late 1990s. And a lot of these undercover detectives that work in these precincts, a lot of the funding went to them. Not much went on because there wasn't much in the way of terrorism in New York City, even though the first terrorist attack, not the 1983 World Trade Center bombing, the assassination of Rabbi Meir Kahane by El Sayed Doser, and of course, the 1923 World Trade Center bombing, well, you would think that New York would be the primary agency, the FBI, that gets direct funding. But even after the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, the FBI's director, James Fox, went on national TV and said, we don't have an Arab fundamentalism problem, even though a firefighter by the name of Ronnie Bucca and John O'Neill and Frank Pellegrino, John Antisev, a couple of these guys out of New York of the Joint Terrorism Task Force and the FBI, they started saying, well, no, that's not true. There is a problem. There's a wider network. And when a fireman basically has more knowledge about Arab fundamentalism than some of these agents out of New York, there's a problem. Is it bureaucracy or ignorance, malfeasance, or a mixture of all three?
We talk about bin Laden and we move forward from September 11, from the embassy bombings. Don't forget about the people who died in ones and twos. Don't forget about our soldiers, our airmen who died at Khobar Towers, the Marines in the barrack bombing, Zach Hernandez, who died in Panama because he was an American soldier. Don't forget about the victims of 17 November that has gone on for decades without resolution until recently, or the Americans kidnapped by Abu Sayyaf and killed, and the Americans kidnapped by the FARC and killed. In addition to all that, 5 of your
Abu
7
Sayyaf
states...
being this militant organization that has close links with Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, and bin Laden's brother-in-law, Mohammed Jamal Khalifa, which is operating out of the Philippines.
Sponsors, counterintelligence responsibilities fall to that same international terrorism operations section. They're working tired, and they're doing a heck of a job.
I appreciate that very much, and I'm, if very briefly,
yes, sir.
The others on the panel would like to come in, because I do want to go to the next subject. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. From a field agent's perspective, I could
Okay, and this person speaking is hiding behind a partition. His name is Steve Bongardt.
probably talk for an hour on resources. The comment in there is mainly due to the fact that criminal resources and criminal agents, it's so manpower intensive, and with the possibility of somebody being let go because you missed something with regards to one of the trials, unfortunately, our managers, I can only try to comprehend their job. They try to leverage our assets as best as they can. So most of the manpower ends up falling on criminal agents as opposed to intelligence. Pragmatically, when I stress that to headquarters, it was just as a matter of being pragmatic. This is how I know it's going to work, just because of the fact that our intelligence investigators were absolutely overworked. Less weekends off than I myself probably had in the last few years. But
and this is one of the reasons we're trying to, or some people are trying to move the investigation into the criminal area from the New York office on Midhar, because of the greater resources in the criminal area than in the investigative area. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I would say a couple weeks later, when we were, after everything happened and we had ramped up, where thousands of FBI agents all over the world were trying to find somebody, I thought to myself, and I don't necessarily know how to do it, but we got to be able to get there. When we find out a Khalid al-Midhar is in the country, intelligence, criminal, or whatever, we got to be able to get to the level we were at September 12th, the afternoon of September 11th, we got to be able to get there before September 11th, not a September 12th.
Let me go right to the...
Yeah, but who do we blame? Do we blame the FBI for that? No, not necessarily, because the CIA and the NSA, who knew about Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi inside the United States, didn't tell the FBI. That's who you blame. And you know what? In the Joint House inquiry, Carl Levin is probably the only person out of the 2 congressional inquiries that put 2 and 2 together and said, hey, why did you sit on this information? And if you haven't listened to that podcast, it's called Carl Levin, the Joint House Inquiry. I forgot the title, but it talks about, I talk about the problem of not sharing information, which could have prevented 9/11 from even happening, just with the CIA.
This, and I'm obviously going to be able to, or not be able to get into the secondary that I wanted to, but this is important. Mr. Rolnice, I think this question is for you, because in your opening statement, you talked about the desire to go to a criminal investigation, but you said we did not have specific credible evidence of criminal activity to do so. My question really is whether, and that's FBI information, but what about the CIA? If you had had if the CIA had been able to convey to you the information that they had, would that perhaps have sufficed to enable you to begin a criminal investigation?
Yes.
I'm not necessarily sure that it would, sir, only because in order to open that criminal investigation, that, just as a counterintelligence investigation, is regulated by Attorney General guidelines. And what we have, to the best of my knowledge, is an individual, 2 individuals of great interest to us at a meeting with another individual that you tied to the coal. Can you make the inference that they're tied to it as well? Given what these people do for a living, you can probably suppose that, but I'm not sure that suffices to be specific and credible enough.
I disagree, because when they were investigating the coal bombing, John O'Neill saw that there was a link between Khalid, who is considered a facilitator of the USS coal bombing, and Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi. Now remember, Khalid actually talked with Khalid al-Midhar on the phone, in which the NSA heard, regarding a summit meeting in Malaysia. Now, you have a a link there. But not only that, you have something better. Khalid al-Mihdhar, Nawaf al-Hazmi, and Khalid were seen at this high-level summit meeting in Malaysia. So if the FBI wanted to run a criminal investigation, they could file a FISA warrant regarding information from the CIA. And this is where they would run into a problem, because they probably wouldn't have shared that information. Because if they did, they would have shared that information and prevented Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi from hijacking American Airlines Flight 77. Would they have stopped all of 9/11? Maybe, maybe not. But they would have at least prevented some of the attacks from happening. But Rolnice is not throwing the CIA under the bus, in which he should. He should be doing it. The CIA intentionally withheld information from the FBI, and he knows it.
That said, and in somewhat of a disagreement with my colleague, resources in the New York office are larger than the resources anywhere else in the country, to include counterintelligence resources. So it's a matter of
that was the headquarters for the terrorist investigation, wasn't it?
It's a matter of management allotting resources in accordance with the importance of the case. It's as simple as that.
Well, and believe me, I'm not criticizing anybody for the management of what they have, but as my colleagues here on the dais will attest, every time we go someplace and ask, is there anything else we can do for you, inevitably one of the things is, well, we could always use more help. But was part of the problem here the fact that the CIA information could not be given to the FBI because of the wall? I mean, your testimony is that these restrictions limited the free flow of information. You couldn't even, for lead purposes, transfer that or get that information transferred over to you.
Sir, if I could comment on that real quick, because I was part of the conversation trying to get this information downgraded. What we will do is, FBI agents wear both hats, intel and criminal. Depending on what's given to us, we try to do whatever we can, even when we're on the criminal side, and we can go into more detail of that in a closed committee hearing. But with regard to that, what our attempt would have been, and it might have been struck down, and even if it had all gone through, we might not have ever found Mihdhar beforehand, was to go to the CIA, have this information downgraded, take what we knew criminally from the coal, then go to a judge and say, this is what we have, Judge. Can you help us out here? You know, we'll swear out what we know.
In other words, at least try.
Yeah, and that's, he's talking about, you know, getting a FISA warrant. You have to go to a judge.
At least try to do it, and that was the main impetus behind going to them, or at least.
Right, now here's the problem, is that the CIA didn't share this information because, according to Mark Rossini, who is working at Alex Station as a liaison from the FBI unit in New York, and John O'Neill entrusted him to get information back to John O'Neill, because the CIA wasn't sharing anything with the FBI officer in New York. But the CIA knew what Mark Rossini was about. And so when Doug Miller, who also is out of the New York office, working as a liaison from the FBI, he read the cable about Khalid al-Mihdhar, Nawaf al-Hazmi's U.S. visa and coming to the United States, and he tried to draft up a cable. However, Tom Wilshire, the deputy chief of Alex Station, basically said, we are not going to share this information with the FBI because it's a jurisdiction matter. What does that mean? Is that they, according to Mark Rossini, he complained to Michelle Ann Casey, who is the lead CIA officer investigating the Yemen hub owned by Ahmed al-Hada. And she told him, and this is according to him, that you're not to share this information with the FBI because we think the next attack is in Malaysia or Southeast Asia. Now, as long as the attacks are outside the United States, it's the CIA's jurisdiction. But anything that's going to happen inside the United States, the FBI takes it over. Maybe that's the reason why the CIA didn't share this information with the FBI. And, you know, it could be that certain people in the CIA wanted these attacks to happen. Or, you know, if that's too much for you, maybe they were trying to flip Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, because that's what Richard Clark likes to think, who's head of the National Security Terrorism Center under the Clinton and Bush administrations. So it could be any one of these scenarios. We really don't know because nobody's talking from Alex Station about the truth.
bringing up the conversation of having certain information downgraded, realizing that we were in a exigent circumstance and this individual had come into the country.
Right. Well, I'll just conclude by saying that we need to get into this whole question of the risk aversion due to the either real or imagined walls, or I shouldn't say imagined, but either proper understandings or misunderstandings about the application of the laws under which both FBI and CIA operated, and the confusion and misunderstandings that resulted from that, and perhaps in some cases the inability to pursue things that might have been productive had they been pursued.
Could I request
If you were
a
holding,
minute? Just
listen, if you were holding the CIA accountable for not sharing this information, which was intentionally withholding from them, and that's proven in the joint house inquiry. I mean, Tom Wilshire wouldn't have a job, neither would George Tenet, and neither would Cofer Black, head of the Counterterrorism Center. At least, the very least, Tenet and Wilshire, for sure. Maybe even Michelle Ann Casey. So this, and it goes right, and also the NSA, right? The NSA didn't share all their information with the CIA or with the State Department or with the Department of Justice or with the FBI. Not, you know, a lot of these agencies hoarded this information for whatever reason, but at least somebody should have gotten fired for this. Nobody did. So I want to hear about this accountability bullshit, because that's
to address this one issue, because it's come up about 4 times just as the light has gone red, and I'd really like to just address it just for a second for the process part of it. The New York meeting, as I think it's become clearer through the Joint Inquiry staff, every place that something could have gone wrong in this over a year and a half, it went wrong. All the processes have been put in place, all the safeguards, everything else. They failed at every possible opportunity. Nothing went wrong.
You failed it. You did, Tom Wilshire. And the reason why you failed it is because you're acting on orders of George Tenet, not to share information with the FBI. But evidently, you're the deputy chief of Alex Station. Your boss is Richard Blee, the chief of station of Alex Station. His boss is George Tenet. All 3 of you should have been fired. At the very least, all 3 of you should have been fired for not sharing information regarding 2 known Al-Qaeda operatives who were indirectly involved with the bombing of the USS Cole and the bombing of the East Africa embassies in Dar es Salaam and in Tanzania. So, yeah,
right.
goodness gracious.
In this particular case, and that's one of the reasons why they have an exchange program at the management level between the FBI and CIA, is when there's an issue like this, there are usually procedures for getting the information cleared rapidly. And as part of what was going on in the Cole investigation at that time, there were some other information not pertaining to photos, not pertaining specifically to Midhar and Hazmi, but pertaining to Malaysia, that the FBI was attempting to get cleared to use in their interviews of various persons who could help them with the Cole investigation. And what the agency was trying to do was to get that stuff cleared, was to get it in a position where it could be used. What we were also, I believe, trying to do through that summer that culminated in kind of the rediscovery of the thing in July, was to stimulate the dialogue between the FBI and CIA on this issue. And normally, and again, nothing normal happened, but normally what happens is if there runs into a conversation block where you have to stop, then you take steps to get it cleared, and then it moves on. So there was no, so the reluctance to pass the information and to, was not a deliberate thing. It was, A, we didn't know if we knew at the time, so all of the information that could have been passed wasn't because we hadn't done it. But also, there was a movement to get it cleared to pass. It just didn't complete.
Yeah, it didn't clear to pass because of people like you, and that's the problem, right? Because you basically, for whatever reason, didn't want to share pertinent information about 2 Al-Qaeda operatives with the FBI, whether you were trying to flip them, whether you basically wanted these something to happen and so for you to take advantage, or maybe it's because of malfeasance. Ignorance. It could be any one of these 3. We really don't know. But what we do know is that there was a failure at the highest levels regarding the intelligence community's handling of this specific incident regarding Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, at the very least, the CIA and the NSA have to be held responsible for these failures, and they were not. All right, guys, have a good night and see you in the next video.